The American Revolution was a pivotal moment in human history, shaping modern democracy and igniting a global quest for freedom. As the first colonial uprising to succeed against a major world power, it sparked a wave of liberation movements that continued to inspire and influence contemporary politics. Join me on a journey through the trials and triumphs of America's founding era, where the seeds of discontent blossomed into a revolution that would forever alter the course of human history. As the embers of the French and Indian War died down, the British Empire was left to grapple with a staggering debt of over £130 million, a sum that would take decades to repay. The war had been costly, with thousands of British soldiers killed or wounded, and the expense of maintaining a vast army in the colonies had put a significant strain on the British treasury. In an effort to recoup some of these losses, the British government turned its attention to the American colonies, seeking to extract revenue from their thriving economies. The first salvo in this campaign was the Sugar Act of 1764, which imposed a tax on sugar, wine, and other luxury goods imported into the colonies. This move was deeply unpopular among colonial merchants, who saw it as an attempt to strangle their trade and stifle their economic growth. The Sugar Act was soon followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to purchase stamps for official documents, newspapers, and even playing cards. The tax was modest, but the principle behind it was not. The British government was asserting its right to tax the colonies without their consent. This sparked widespread outrage, with colonial leaders like Patrick Henry and James Otis Jr. denouncing the Stamp Act as a blatant example of tyranny. Resistance organizations began to spring up in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, where patriots like Samuel Adams and John Hancock organized boycotts and protests against British goods. As tensions simmered, the British government continued to tighten the screws, imposing the Townshend Acts in 1767, which taxed glass, paint, paper, and other essential goods. The colonists responded with a wave of non-importation agreements, refusing to buy British goods and instead promoting domestic industries like textiles and shipbuilding. This was not just an economic strategy. It was also a powerful statement of defiance, as colonists began to see themselves as a distinct people with their own interests and values. But the situation took a deadly turn on March 5, 1770, when a confrontation between British soldiers and American colonists in Boston's King Street ended in bloodshed. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be known, was a pivotal moment in the escalating crisis, as public sentiment began to shift decisively against the British. 5 colonists were killed, including a young sailor named Crispus Attucks, who became an instant martyr for the Patriot cause. The event was seized upon by colonial propagandists like Paul Revere, who created inflammatory engravings of the massacre that helped to galvanize opposition to British rule. As the Boston Massacre continued to fuel outrage against British rule, a new era of coordinated resistance began to take shape. In 1772, the Massachusetts House of Representatives established the First Committee of Correspondence, a revolutionary innovation that would become a hallmark of colonial unity. This committee, composed of prominent patriots like Samuel Adams and James Otis Jr., was tasked with communicating the grievances of Massachusetts to other colonies, fostering a sense of shared purpose and coordination among the disparate regions. The committees of correspondence quickly sprouted up in other colonies, weaving a network of messengers, printers, and activists who facilitated the exchange of ideas, intelligence, and strategies. This clandestine communication system allowed colonial leaders to stay informed about British policies, share tactics for resistance, and mobilize support for joint actions. As the committees of correspondence flourished, they played a crucial role in transforming isolated protests into a cohesive, continent-wide movement. Meanwhile, the British government continued to misjudge the depth of colonial discontent. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies and allowed the company to sell tea directly to consumers, bypassing local merchants. This move was seen as a brazen attempt to exert control over colonial commerce and revive the flagging fortunes of the East India Company. The response was immediate and fierce. On December 16, 1773, A group of Boston patriots, disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and hurled 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was a daring act of defiance that electrified the colonies and sent shockwaves through the British establishment. The British government, determined to crush the growing rebellion, responded with a series of punitive measures known as the Intolerable Acts. Passed in 1774, these acts effectively abolished the Massachusetts colonial government, closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, and allowed British officials to be tried in England or other colonies rather than in Massachusetts. The Coercive Acts, as they were also known, aimed to isolate and intimidate Massachusetts, but they had the opposite effect. They galvanized opposition throughout the colonies, as patriots from New York to Virginia rallied to support their beleaguered brethren in Massachusetts. As tensions escalated, colonial leaders recognized the need for a unified response. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, a historic assembly that would forge a common front against British tyranny. The Congress, attended by luminaries like George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams, issued a statement of grievances, called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, and established the Continental Association, a boycott of all British goods, and a pledge to discontinue exports to Britain until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. This economic strategy, designed to pressure the British government into concessions, marked a significant escalation of the conflict, as the colonies began to sever their economic ties with the mother country. As the First Continental Congress disbanded in October 1774, the colonies were left to ponder the implications of their bold stance against British tyranny. The winter months that followed were marked by a sense of uneasy calm as both sides awaited the other's next move. But beneath the surface, tensions continued to simmer, and it was only a matter of time before the conflict would escalate into violence. In April 1775, General Thomas Gage, the British commander-in-chief in North America, received intelligence that the Massachusetts militia had stockpiled arms and ammunition in the towns of Lexington and Concord. Determined to seize these supplies and crush the rebellion before it gained momentum, Gage dispatched a contingent of approximately 700 British soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn. Their mission was to march on Lexington and Concord, secure the arms, and apprehend the rebel leaders. As the British troops set out on the night of April 18, 1775, they were unaware that their plans had been compromised by colonial sympathizers within their own ranks. Paul Revere and William Dawes, 2 prominent patriots, had been alerted to the impending raid and were already racing ahead to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock in Lexington, as well as the militia commanders in Concord. The famous midnight ride of these 2 messengers would become an enduring symbol of American patriotism as they galloped through the darkness, shouting warnings to all who would listen. "The regulars are coming! The regulars are coming!" At dawn on April 19, 1775, the British troops arrived in Lexington's Old North Square, where they encountered a contingent of about 70 militiamen, known as the Lexington Militia, under the command of Captain John Parker. The atmosphere was tense, with both sides aware that the slightest spark could ignite a wider conflict. Major Pitcairn, attempting to disperse the colonists, ordered them to lay down their arms and leave the area. But the militiamen, steadfast in their resolve, refused to back down. In the ensuing standoff, a shot rang out, later immortalized as "the shot heard round the world," and the British troops opened fire on the Lexington militia. 8 colonists were killed, and 10 others were wounded in the brief but intense skirmish. The British then continued their march towards Concord, where they encountered more resistance from the militia. At the Old North Bridge in Concord, the colonial forces had set up a defensive position, and as the British approached, they unleashed a withering volley of musket fire that sent the redcoats reeling. The British troops were forced to retreat back towards Boston, harassed by the militiamen at every turn. This running battle, which would come to be known as the Battle of Lexington and Concord, marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. As news of the clashes spread like wildfire throughout the colonies, the militia mobilized in response, laying siege to British-occupied Boston. The city was now effectively under blockade, with thousands of colonial troops encircling the British forces. General Gage, realizing that his situation was becoming increasingly untenable, appealed for reinforcements from London. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened on May 10, 1775, with representatives from all 13 colonies in attendance. This gathering would prove to be a pivotal moment in American history, as the delegates began to coalesce around the idea of creating a unified continental army to confront the British. George Washington, a respected military leader from Virginia, was appointed commander-in-chief of this new force, which would come to be known as the Continental Army. As the summer of 1775 wore on, tensions continued to escalate in and around Boston. In June, the Continental Army, now under Washington's command, fortified Breed's Hill, a strategic location overlooking the city. The British, determined to dislodge them, launched a series of frontal assaults against the colonial positions. The Battle of Bunker Hill, fought on June 17, 1775, would prove to be one of the bloodiest engagements of the war, with over 1,000 British casualties and nearly 500 American losses. As the summer of 1775 wore on, the Continental Army's siege of Boston continued, with Washington's forces firmly entrenched around the city. Meanwhile, a seismic shift was taking place in the realm of public opinion, thanks in large part to Thomas Paine's influential pamphlet, Common Sense. Published in January 1776, Paine's masterpiece galvanized support for independence from Britain. Using plain language and persuasive arguments to make the case for breaking free from monarchical rule. With over 500 copies sold, it became one of the best-selling publications of the 18th century, reaching a broad audience and shaping the debate over American independence. Paine's ideas resonated deeply with the colonists, who were increasingly frustrated with British taxation policies, the restrictions on trade and commerce, and the lack of representation in Parliament. As Common Sense spread like wildfire, it helped to crystallize public opinion, pushing many undecided Americans toward the radical notion of declaring independence from Britain. The pamphlet's impact was particularly evident in the colony's provincial assemblies, where debates over breaking with Britain grew more heated and intense. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress continued to grapple with the question of independence. While some delegates, such as John Dickinson, remained committed to reconciliation with Britain, others, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, were convinced that a complete break was necessary. As the debate raged on, a committee was formed in June 1776 to draft a formal Declaration of Independence. This esteemed group, comprising Jefferson, Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman, set out to craft a document that would not only announce America's separation from Britain, but also provide a philosophical foundation for the new nation. The drafting process was marked by intense discussion and compromise, as the committee members brought their unique perspectives to the table. Jefferson, tasked with writing the initial draft, drew heavily from Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, incorporating ideas about natural rights, social contracts, and the inherent value of individual liberty. However, other delegates, such as Franklin and Adams, offered significant revisions, tempering some of Jefferson's more radical language and ensuring that the document would appeal to a broad coalition of colonists. The Declaration of Independence, adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, was a masterful blend of philosophical principles and pragmatic politics. Its eloquent preamble, which declared that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights, has become one of the most iconic passages in American history. Yet, the document also reflected the compromises and contradictions of its time, notably the omission of any explicit condemnation of slavery, a glaring inconsistency that would haunt the new nation for generations to come. As the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Army faced a daunting task, defending their newly declared nation against the British Empire's mighty military. In August 1776, General William Howe's forces landed on Long Island, and Washington's army was forced to retreat from New York City. The British victory at the Battle of Brooklyn Heights in late August marked the beginning of a long and arduous campaign for the Continental Army. Washington's troops fell back to Harlem Heights, where they managed to secure a narrow victory in September, But ultimately, they were compelled to abandon New York City and retreat northward. The autumn of 1776 was a bleak time for the Continental Army. Morale was low and desertions were rampant. Washington knew that he had to act swiftly to restore his army's confidence and demonstrate that they could still inflict significant damage on the British. In December 1776, he devised a bold plan to cross the icy Delaware River and launch a surprise attack on Hessian forces stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. On Christmas Day, Washington's troops embarked on their perilous journey, braving treacherous waters and freezing temperatures. The successful crossing of the Delaware was followed by a decisive victory at Trenton on December 26, where the Continental Army captured over 900 Hessian soldiers. The momentum gained from the Trenton victory carried over into the new year. On January 3, 1777, Washington's forces defeated the British at Princeton, New Jersey, securing another crucial win and demonstrating that they could adapt to changing circumstances on the battlefield. These victories in the winter of 1776-77 were a turning point for the Continental Army, as they helped to boost morale and attract new recruits. As the spring of 1777 arrived, Washington's attention turned to the Northern Theater, where British General John Burgoyne was launching an ambitious campaign to split the colonies and force a negotiated settlement. Burgoyne's army marched south from Canada, intent on capturing Albany, New York, while a secondary force under General Barry St. Leger would move eastward from Lake Ontario to join forces with him. However, the British plan was thwarted by the Continental Army's victory at the Battle of Saratoga in September and October 1777. The American forces, led by General Horatio Gates, successfully repelled Burgoyne's advances, and on October 17, the British general was forced to surrender his entire army. The Saratoga campaign marked a significant turning point in the war, as it convinced France to ally itself with the Americans, providing substantial financial and military aid. The Continental Army's victory also demonstrated that they could compete against British regulars on the battlefield, which helped to shift the balance of power in their favor. As the winter of 1777-78 approached, Washington's army settled into a harsh encampment at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where they would face one of the most challenging periods of the war. The winter at Valley Forge was brutal, with temperatures often dropping below freezing and snowdrifts reaching as high as 6 feet. The Continental Army suffered from inadequate shelter, clothing, and food, and disease swept through the camp, claiming hundreds of lives. However, despite these hardships, Washington's army used the winter months to undergo a significant transformation. Under the tutelage of Prussian military officer Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the Continental Army began to adopt more rigorous training regimens and tactical formations, which would eventually make them a more formidable force on the battlefield. As the Continental Army emerged from the crucible of Valley Forge, they were bolstered by the news of France's formal alliance with the United States, signed on February 6, 1778. This diplomatic breakthrough had far-reaching consequences, drawing the conflict into a global revolution that would engulf multiple European powers. The French provided significant financial and military aid, including troops, ships, and supplies, which helped to shift the balance of power in favor of the Americans. The entry of France into the war also prompted other European nations to reevaluate their positions. Spain, which had long been wary of British expansion, declared war on Britain in June 1779, hoping to regain control of territories lost during the 7 Years' War. The Netherlands, too, eventually joined the fray, declaring war on Britain in December 1780, after years of tensions over trade and colonial disputes. As these new belligerents entered the conflict, the war began to take on a truly global character, with battles fought on multiple continents and oceans. The expansion of the war at sea was particularly significant, as naval warfare and privateering became increasingly important components of the conflict. The French Navy, under the command of Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, played a crucial role in challenging British dominance of the seas. American privateers, such as John Paul Jones, also made their mark, launching daring raids on British shipping and disrupting supply lines. One notable example was Jones's attack on the British ship HMS Drake in April 1778, which demonstrated the effectiveness of American naval power. The economic impact of the war was also becoming increasingly pronounced. The British Navy's blockade of American ports had crippled trade, leading to shortages and inflation. The Continental Congress responded by issuing paper currency, which rapidly depreciated in value, exacerbating the economic crisis. Meanwhile, the French were providing significant financial support to the Americans, but their own economy was beginning to feel the strain of the war effort. The cost of maintaining a large army and navy, combined with the disruption of trade, had led to food shortages and unrest in France, setting the stage for the eventual collapse of the French monarchy. As the war dragged on, the financial burden began to take its toll on all parties involved. The British government, facing growing opposition to the war at home, was struggling to finance its military efforts. The cost of maintaining a large army in North America, combined with the expense of naval operations and subsidies to loyalist groups, had led to significant increases in taxation, which further eroded public support for the war. In contrast, the Americans were able to rely on French financial support, as well as their own resourcefulness and determination to sustain their war effort. In 1780, the economic situation became even more dire as a harsh winter and poor harvests led to widespread shortages and discontent. The Continental Army, struggling to maintain its strength and morale, was forced to rely on makeshift supplies and foraging expeditions to survive. Meanwhile, the British Army, under the command of General Charles Cornwallis, launched a series of campaigns in the southern colonies, hoping to exploit the economic weaknesses of the Americans and gain a decisive advantage. As the British Army shifted its focus to the southern colonies in 1778, General Charles Cornwallis launched a series of campaigns aimed at exploiting the economic weaknesses of the Americans and gaining a decisive advantage. The British Southern strategy relied on winning the support of loyalist groups and using them to pacify the region, thereby allowing British forces to concentrate on defeating the Continental Army. However, this approach ultimately backfired as it sparked a wave of guerrilla warfare and frontier conflicts that would prove difficult to contain. In the summer of 1780, Cornwallis's army marched into South Carolina, intent on crushing the rebel forces in the region. However, they were met with fierce resistance from partisan groups led by Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, who employed hit-and-run tactics to harass and disrupt British supply lines. These guerrilla warriors, often operating in small bands, launched surprise attacks on British patrols, ambushed their convoys, and destroyed their depots, making it increasingly difficult for Cornwallis to maintain his army's strength and morale. One notable example of the effectiveness of these partisan groups was the Battle of Kings Mountain, fought on October 7, 1780. A force of approximately 1,000 Patriot militiamen, led by William Campbell, James Williams, and Isaac Shelby, launched a surprise attack on a Loyalist camp at Kings Mountain, South Carolina. The Loyalists, numbering around 100, were largely unprepared for the assault and were quickly overwhelmed, suffering over 900 casualties. This decisive victory not only boosted Patriot morale, but also demonstrated the potential of guerrilla warfare to weaken British control in the region. The following year, Cornwallis's army clashed with a force of Continental troops led by General Nathaniel Greene at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781. Although the British technically won the battle, they suffered heavy casualties and were ultimately forced to retreat from the field. This Pyrrhic victory marked a turning point in the war, as Cornwallis's army began to weaken and the Patriots gained momentum. In the months that followed, Greene's forces continued to harass and disrupt British operations, setting the stage for a decisive confrontation at the Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781. Led by General Daniel Morgan, a force of approximately 1,000 Patriot troops defeated a larger British army under Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, killing or capturing over 800 enemy soldiers. This crushing defeat further eroded British control in the region and paved the way for the eventual surrender of Cornwallis's army. As the war in the South reached its climax, General George Washington launched a bold campaign to trap and defeat Cornwallis's army. In the summer of 1781, Washington's forces, supported by a large French army under the Comte de Rochambeau, marched towards Virginia, intent on confronting Cornwallis at Yorktown. The British general, realizing his position was untenable, attempted to escape across the York River but was thwarted by a French naval fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse. With his army trapped and outnumbered, Cornwallis launched a series of desperate attacks against the Allied lines, but these were repelled with heavy losses. On October 19, 1781, after a prolonged siege, Cornwallis attempted to break through the American and French lines, but this effort was decisively defeated. Realizing his situation was hopeless, Cornwallis requested a ceasefire and began negotiations for the surrender of his army. As Cornwallis's army surrendered at Yorktown on October 19, 1781, the British government began to realize that the war was lost. The news of the defeat sparked a shift in British politics, with Prime Minister Lord North resigning and being replaced by Lord Rockingham, who was more inclined to negotiate a peace treaty. The American diplomats, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, had already begun secret negotiations with British officials in Paris, laying the groundwork for a formal peace agreement. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, officially ended the American Revolutionary War and recognized American independence from Great Britain. The treaty established the boundaries of the new nation, with the Mississippi River serving as the western border, and provided for the evacuation of British troops from American territory. The negotiations were not without challenges, however, as the Americans had to navigate the complex web of alliances between European powers, including France, Spain, and the Netherlands. As the newly independent nation began to take shape, it became clear that the Articles of Confederation, which had been adopted in 1781, were inadequate for governing the country. The Articles provided for a weak central government with limited powers, leaving most authority to the individual states. This led to a period known as the Critical Period, during which the young nation struggled to address issues such as debt, trade, and national defense. The lack of a strong central government made it difficult to coordinate policies and respond to external threats, leading to concerns about the long-term viability of the American experiment. In response to these challenges, a group of visionaries, including George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, began to advocate for a new constitutional framework that would provide for a stronger federal government. In 1787, they convened the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where they drafted a new constitution that would eventually become the foundation of the United States government. The Constitution established a system of checks and balances, with 3 branches of government, and provided for the protection of individual rights and liberties. The ratification of the Constitution was not without controversy, however, as many Americans were skeptical of the idea of a strong central government. The Federalist Papers, a series of essays written by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, played a crucial role in persuading the public to support the new Constitution. The essays provided a detailed explanation of the Constitution's provisions and addressed concerns about the potential for abuse of power. As the United States began to take its place on the world stage, the American Revolution's impact on global democratic movements became increasingly evident. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was heavily influenced by the American example, with many French revolutionaries drawing inspiration from the ideas of liberty, equality, and democracy that had been enshrined in the American Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution also inspired similar movements in other parts of the world, including Latin America and Europe, as people began to demand greater freedom and representation from their governments. In the years following the Constitutional Convention, Washington, Madison, and Hamilton continued to play leading roles in shaping the new government. Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, serving 2 terms from 1789 to 1797. Madison, often referred to as the father of the Constitution, went on to serve as Secretary of State and later as president himself. Hamilton, who had played a key role in shaping the Constitution's financial provisions, served as Secretary of the Treasury and worked to establish a national bank and a system of tariffs. The American Revolution was a pivotal moment in modern history, shaping the course of democracy, freedom, and self-governance for centuries to come. Its impact resonates far beyond the borders of the United States, inspiring movements for liberty and equality around the world. As we reflect on the bravery, perseverance, and vision of the men and women who fought for American independence, we are reminded that the true power of revolution lies not in its ability to topple empires, but in its capacity to transform human imagination and aspirations. The American Revolution's legacy continues to unfold, a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity's quest for a more just, equal, and free world. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. Until we meet again, I'm Herodotus, reminding you that history isn't just a story, it's our story. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that to understand the present, we must first understand the past.